Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning to you all, depending on where you're joining from. We're delighted to have you here again today for the third webinar in our current series focused on the topic of Pillar 2 and the associated technical, technological, and practical considerations. Today's webinar will be focused on the technology matters connected to the topic of Pillar 2. Couple of points of admin before we begin. So first of all, due to the number of people on the call today, your mics are muted. However, we would of course love you to interact with us throughout the session. So with that in mind, there will be a couple of polling questions as we go, and you're also welcome to place questions in the Q&A box through the session. We'll try to respond to questions in the webinar where we can, or otherwise we will collate and pick up the questions at the end of the webinar. We are, of course, also available for follow-up discussions after the webinar to address your specific circumstances in more detail, or please feel free to contact the speakers today or get in touch with your usual BDO contact for a more in-depth discussion. And we will be sharing the slides and recording from today with you all after the event. So without further ado, I will hand over to Ian to take us through the agenda for today.
Thanks, Ross. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate you taking the time. As Ross mentioned, my name's Ian Bowden. I'm a tax partner at BDO, and I'm head of our tax automation and innovation practice. So this is quite a big topic and a big area for us, and we've got quite a bit of ground to cover in the next 35 minutes or so. So hopefully the topics that we picked out are useful for you as we kind of go through. So the plan for today is we'll give you a very brief overview of the market. We'll focus quite a lot in terms of the complexities around the data side of things and what organizations are doing and thinking about from that side. And then we'll flip quickly into the technology in terms of the types of tech that's out there, how do you pick the right one, and we'll finish up with a couple of case studies. And as Ross mentioned, hopefully time at the end for a couple of questions, so please do get them fired into the Q&A, and between Herb and I, we'll pick those up. So let's get going today. So the first area that we just wanted to kind of cover on the next slide there, Nat, is just to give a little bit of context to this in terms of what we're seeing and how organizations are thinking about this in the round. And it's fascinating. I've been in this industry for about the last 30 years, and what we've really noticed in the last few years is that organizations are trying to take a slightly more holistic view in terms of how they respond to things like Pillar 2, which is the main topic of our discussion today, but also some of the more nuanced or newer areas of the tax transformation agendas that are cropping up as you go through. And instead of organizations coming to us and asking us, well, what is the best point solution, Ian, to solve this particular problem, we're having a lot more conversations where groups are looking holistically. And the reason for putting these three categories up on screen is that you'll start seeing themes as we start getting into the types of technology available, and in terms of the best options for you, it's worth thinking about it from this particular lens. So when organizations start thinking about Pillar 2, it's worth looking at your existing systems, your existing IT infrastructure, and whether there's things that you already have that can help. And that's a great starting point because it's key to this topic, and we'll be hearing this quite a lot today, is around data. The second area is that there is a huge amount of technology innovation that has happened in response to these new trends, these new changes, these new introductions, and the software vendors have responded really well. But instead of thinking about things in isolation, what else is coming down the line, and how else could I use some of that data to enable me to reuse a tool to do multiple things for me? And finally, in terms of the context, is for some organizations, a little bit of duct tape, a little bit of sticking plaster is going to be the way forward. So groups thinking about short term, what do I need to do to get through this, is still a very useful strategy. And I think that's the key word here, it's strategy. What we're seeing is that it doesn't have to be hugely detailed, it doesn't have to be hugely significant, but the starting point for most organizations when they're looking at something like Pillar 2 is, have I got the right operating model? And what's my plan for dealing with it? Am I going to outsource it? Am I going to insource it? Do I need to buy a bit of technology? And we'll kick some of that around today. So passing over to Herb to say hi, and the next slide, please, Nat.
Hi, everyone. I'm Herb Lockyer, a managing director from BDO USA's Tax Automation and Innovation practice. It's not business as usual for tax departments in recent times. There are a lot of challenging circumstances facing tax professionals. We've highlighted some of the key difficulties here on this slide. And now with the introduction of Pillar 2, large multinationals have an entirely new set of global regulations that impact tax provision calculations and compliance processes. We feel that companies should take this opportunity to build a business case for transformation. I mean, how else can we all deal with new complexities while also getting things done faster and more accurately with possibly reduced headcount and a demand for increased transparency? Business as usual or same as last year approaches will not help you rise to the occasion. Our recommendations to take this tough situation and turn it into an opportunity to build a business case, to invest in your data, process, technology, and your people, and transform your tax department into a more modern and nimble group. Only through automation and innovation will you be able to adjust to not only Pillar 2, but everything else going on. Your existing systems and technology likely need an update in order to accurately reflect the impact of Pillar 2 in your existing tax provision and compliance process, as well as to any tax forecasting and scenario analysis that you might be performing. Now, Ian's going to discuss 3 big drivers for transformation from our perspective.
Yeah, and I think just a very last point on that slide, I think we saw this for those on the call from the UK. We saw organizations taking advantage of, say, the Making Tax Digital for VAT. When that got introduced into the UK, we saw it as an excuse or a way in which we could ask for business case or budget to do something because it's mandatory, it's required, we have to do something. And I think we're seeing similar with the Pillar 2. It's a recognition that there's new things that have landed and we have to do something to respond to them. So can we use these regulatory changes to help us create a business case? Because sometimes with the tax technology world, it's difficult to put a return on the investment immediately. I know it's often attributed to Bill Gates, but we kind of overestimate the return on the investment we'll get in the first year, but we drastically underestimate the return on the investment we'll get in years 2 to 5. And I think that's worth considering in terms of the long-term plan. But thanks for that, Herb. And just in terms of the next slide, Nat, we talked, this session is very much around Pillar 2 and how we're responding to that, but it's worth thinking about that holistic view again in the rounds and other things that are coming down that could have an impact on us. You know, hopefully you've joined Ross's other sessions in terms of the technicalities of Pillar 2, so we're not going to cover those areas. But we flashed this on screen in terms of groups are thinking about, whilst they're looking at their Pillar 2 and country-by-country reporting, what's the impact on my tax provision side of things as well? How can I use the data that I gather for tax provision to feed some of the Pillar 2 data points as we go through? And what else is coming down the line? So in the indirect tax world, you've got, you know, e-invoicing and everything else, but the ESG agenda is a really important topic. We're seeing a huge amount around plastic packaging taxes, carbon emissions, all of these new introductions that are requiring data. And I know that's that word again, and that's the theme of this. It's how can I take advantage of the data that's there and repurpose it for different things as we go along. So I didn't want people just to be thinking about this from a business case perspective in terms of isolation, in terms of Pillar 2. I want us to be thinking about it in terms of everything else that's going to be happening in Pillar 2 is just one of those nuances that are there. And Herb, onto the challenges, really.
Sure. So next slide, please. So organizations that are subject to Pillar 2 are grappling with the effects the rules are having on their business operations, and they want to minimize the expected increased tax burden. Some companies are going through legal entity restructuring or altering their operational business decisions to reduce the impact of Pillar 2. Many areas of the business are dealing with these changes, but none greater than the uphill battle faced by tax professionals. We've highlighted 3 key major impacts to tax, with the tax technical challenges underlying them all. Safe harbor calculations and GloBE ETR calculations are now a part of the tax provision process.
Seem to be Herb. I don't know if it's just me, but I think I may have lost you.
Oh,
But you're back.
can you hear me now? There are potentially
Yeah.
hundreds of new data points that tax professionals will have to pull in order to perform these GLOBE calculations. In our opinion, it's too voluminous to handle appropriately with just a spreadsheet, which is really driving us towards automation solutions in third-party tax software to produce the calculation in a repeatable and scalable way. Most are buying or building solutions, and some are outsourcing if they can't handle it internally. The OECD model rules are complicated, but from a tax reporting standpoint, it gets even more complex when you realize that the rules are being localized at a country level. Each jurisdiction could theoretically have its own nuances and unique items to address. It's a lot to track. And beyond the tax provision and reporting impact, there's a new compliance burden coming in the near future as jurisdictions will start to require GLOBE information returns. So companies need a solution for the provision, the information return filings, and overall scenario analysis of the P2 impact as the company's business operations and fact patterns change over time. And we're not too far away from Q1 provision time. Do you have a process in place to perform the Pillar 2 calcs? Do you have the appropriate technology and process in place to help with the data wrangling and technical complexities? And that brings us to our first polling question.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. But when we're looking at this, I had a conversation with a client this morning. In their head, in their conversation with their CFO, they'd hoped or they'd thought that Pillar 2 was just going to be them building another spreadsheet, but it's not. There's so much complexity around the local nuances that it just feels too risky, too dangerous. And when the systems have responded so well, it's the sensible choices are to look at, see what others are doing and how they're doing it. But let's see how far everyone else has got through this process. Hopefully on screen now, and to try and get a little bit of feedback from you, we've got our first polling question. We've got a couple of these today, but I'd really appreciate your thoughts in terms of how far you are through your own process in preparing for Pillar 2. And we'll just leave that up on screen for a second. It's been interesting when we've been having conversations with clients. It's different stages, so I'm just keen to get your perspectives here today, Rob. And there we go. So, interesting mix. Couple haven't really got moving yet, and so over 50% are still in the very early stages, are not yet started. Thoughts on that in terms of what you're seeing in the US, Herb?
Yeah, I agree. I think these results are pretty consistent with what you're seeing, with what we're seeing here in the US, is that people are starting to do some safe harbor analysis and maybe starting to do some modeling. Not as many are sort of far along in the further stages there.
Yeah, and I just add, so it is definitely consistent with the conversations that I'm having, and I think in part some businesses may not be within the scope of the rules because of the timing of their particular year end. But what I would say is that it's quite a long lead in to really getting ready to deal with Pillar 2, and I'd really encourage everyone not to leave it too long. We've already heard about some of the different areas that it touches, and it is a complex topic, and the sooner you get a handle on it, the better, because there are options and approaches to take operational or even structural changes in your business that may significantly simplify your approach to Pillar 2 compliance if you can get in there early enough.
I think that's a great point. I think from a UK perspective, a number of our December year-end clients are just trying to get through year-end right now, so you can understand their focus is elsewhere. But people are starting to come out of that process and that period. And I think this is absolutely a number one priority for many, because as part of that process, they've had to do disclosure statements. They've had to think about what the impact's going to be on their cash positions, what they're going to do for half year, their forecasting, and some of these numbers are going to have a material impact. So I think, certainly based on what my diary is looking like, the Pillar 2 conversations are hotting up at the moment. But let's move this along, and on the next slide, I think is the key area, and we've kind of started. We touched on it at the beginning in terms of data complexity. I think we're and Nat, can we just flip the slides on, please? Perfect, thank you. And one more. Right, and I think in terms of data, it's I'll pass over to Herb in a second. This is very much a data challenge. How are we using this in this type of area? So it'd be great to hear from you, Herb, in terms of the strategy.
Yeah, so a rhetorical question for the group is, do you have a tax data strategy? Now that we realize we have a new calculation that's interwoven with our tax provision, and it requires data points that we never thought about previously, we're in a situation where we need to put a new tax data strategy in place. As your company grows and naturally evolves over time, you need to be agile, and you need to be able to assess your P2 impact in short order. When it's quarter end and your books are closing and the underlying numbers are changing throughout, as they always do, are you going to be able to quickly update your calcs as the CFO asks you what your effective rate is? Data needs to be accessible, needs to be good data, the right data. It needs to be organized, structured, and standardized, potentially across multiple ledgers and ERPs across the globe for large multinationals. When the CFO asks you for input and advice on the potential tax impact of a transaction, are you going to say, I'll get back to you in a couple weeks? That's likely not fast enough. And perhaps they want that answer in a matter of hours. So can you pull all the data you need in a repeatable and scalable way, so that as new questions come up and new situations arise, you're armed with the proper data to respond accurately? One of the most key items on this slide is the second line item here that says, establish master data management for tax. What we mean by master data is non-transactional data characteristics, such as your legal entity structure, types of legal entities and flow-throughs, the jurisdictions you're in, the elections you've made specific to Pillar 2, as well as categorization of accounts and adjustments. And we'll get into that a little bit more on the next slide. Do you have anything to add on that, Ian?
No, I think I think we're frequently underestimating, particularly for Pillar 2, with the number of data points, how hard it is to get access to all of those. And I think we'll touch on it in a minute when we look at the different types of technology solutions. But it's an exercise, and it's quite a big one.
So getting control over your tax master data is really the first fundamental step in automating tax calculations and configuring tax systems. So again, when we say master data, we're not referring to transactional data like your trial balance values or numbers on a spreadsheet. It's really that essential building block for automation, your metadata. So again, your legal entities, your ownership structure, currencies, other dimensions of data, mappings, elections and rules. This is all master data. And your automation rules that define a source of data and the intended target or receiving area of that data is also master data. Once that's in place, there's a process to update and maintain it. You can then begin to reap the benefits of an automated or systemated process. Tax software is generally set up to help you identify and maintain your master data. You'll find this information in the administrative area of all the major solutions on the market. And if you don't have a tax system for this, at a very minimum, you can define your master data in tables in a spreadsheet, which would be the most basic way to handle it. When you're working on master data, you need to ensure it's at the appropriate level of granularity in order to achieve the automation that you're looking for. So in some cases, you may need to dive deeper into your underlying data beyond just trial balance accounts. You may need to look at other levels of granularity. You'll see on this slide, we're visually presenting ETL workflows and data visualizations on the slide, and underlying all of these is a strong grasp of tax master data. And if this is not something you feel you have a good handle on, we recommend working on it as part of a system implementation or a larger overall transformation project.
Yeah, and I think if we flip onto the next slide, I think where that comes to life a little bit, and I'm not expecting and I'm not hoping that you guys are going to read this in detail, but I wanted to show this as an illustrative example. What we've done here is, and we'll come on to this in a second when we talk about the different systems that are out there. We've gone through all of the various tax products that have been produced on the market to deliver Pillar 2 solutions. And what we've looked to do is kind of create some accelerators to help us implement those systems on your behalf and for you. And we've broken each of the kind of Pillar 2 categories down. So you can see where we're talking entity data, the safe harbor, the adjusted covered taxes. And we've started to give them an element of traffic lighting in terms of where have we been able to find most of the green data or the dark green data. We're finding that within finance systems. But having done a few hundred of these already, there's certain elements where there's some red flags, there's some warnings where we are struggling to find that data within core products. And when we talked about that kind of holistic approach, where's the data coming from? Are you able to get that from core systems? Have you got a consolidation system? Are you pulling that data from somewhere else? There's quite a lot of reds, particularly when you get into the adjusted covered taxes calculation and things like that, where it's just not available within the systems. It's just not there, and we're having to go digging for that or creating that data. And back to Herb's point around getting a handle on where these data points are. It could be accruals, it could be deemed distribution taxes, it could be whatever. There's a huge amount we just can't find. And so what we've done for each of the bits of it out there is we've created this traffic light approach and this rapid implementation to help you go through your data, go through your systems and say, are you able to populate the greens easily enough? And yeah, you'd hope so because of all the other things that have come before. Where are you going to get some of this red data from? And so taking a super simple example on the country by country reporting, which hopefully many of you have already done before, we're able to get most of the data from source systems. So that's a really good one that can be automated. For some groups, they may not have headcount, so they may not track the number of employees inside their source systems. They might have a different system, so we need to grab that. But then we can kind of pick up some whether are less likely. And we found this a really useful exercise as we're kind of going through the data to try and understand which of the new Pillar 2 requirements is going to cause us most concern from a calculation perspective, because we haven't got access to that. And starting with this will save you a lot of time and a lot of money, because if you can't get access to this, then you might not necessarily benefit from the most fancy technology tools that have got integration and various other things if your raw data isn't there as part and parcel of it. So it's back to the strategy, it's back to the data plan. But we've really seen a lot of benefit for organizations starting with this type of color coding approach to find where their starting point is. And that leads us nicely, Natalie, in terms of, if we can flip onto the next slide, in terms of where the systems come into play. So we've covered a little bit in terms of the data complexities, but what's really impressed me in terms of how the market has responded is the fact that they have responded incredibly quickly. And the reason that they've done that is that the tax technology vendors have spotted an opportunity. You have to go and buy something. You're going to need something in this area. You're going to need to outsource, or you're going to have to buy something. So they've responded well, and at various different price points. And what we've got on the screen is just some examples. This isn't a complete list, but we're really appreciative that the software vendors have all responded well and produced something. And some of them sit into different categories. And it's back to that original 3 boxes we showed on the first slide in terms of what are your existing systems? What's the market done to respond? And then our sticking plaster type solutions. And on our left-hand side, we've been really impressed with a lot of the vendors, because this is a data issue where you have a consolidation system in place. Some of the consolidation systems have been able to include tax modules as part and parcel of their core products. And that's been a huge win, because your IT teams don't necessarily need to be convinced to go and get a new tool. You can potentially take advantage of something that you already have. So if you're using an Oracle system, if you're using a Tagetic solution, if you're using a OneStream product, did you know that there are tax modules that can help and can deliver Pillar 2 as part and parcel of those kind of product packages? So these consolidation systems are a great starting point if you have one, and if one of these names is yours, to be able to access data, pull data in, and you may well get lucky in terms of you've already got licenses or existing bundles that will enable you to do that for free. The next categories is the vendors that have responded where they've got products that can be a little bit more standalone. And there's some very well-known household names on here, and there's one or two new names, hopefully, that have reached this kind of list, where their solutions are very much geared up. And they are all at different price points, and they are all developing at different rates. Some have progressed quicker than others. Some have quite complex models associated with them. Some of them can handle all of the jurisdictions already, and some of them are getting there. But what is great is the fact that there is options available. From BDO's perspective, we've taken that holistic view. We are not tied to any particular vendor. We can give you that insight into which would work for you, help you identify which is the right product for you in the market, some household names. But when we're doing this again, it's back to is there a vendor here that could do one or two or three things for you? So you're not just looking at buying a point solution, you're doing something that could potentially help with 2 or 3 different areas. So on the first page, it's the existing systems and the vendors that have responded. But if we flip onto the next slide, just to kind of complete the picture on this, we kind of look at our, flip that on one page. Thanks, Natalie. It's the sticking plaster solutions. What are people doing? And we'll hear from Herb in terms of a case study at the end in terms of people that have done that. You may have some existing products that you're using for management reporting. Obviously, Excel is always in there, but we try to avoid that where possible, and products that can potentially help with the data wrangling side. I wouldn't necessarily be encouraging you to use these for the calculations, but they can be helpful as part and parcel of that overall strategy and that overall program. I'm not suggesting that groups will not try and build something in Excel, but there's so much complexities there. And when the vendors have done such a good job, it just seems like a very sensible and lower risk approach. But Herb, do you just want to touch on anything on that, or move on to the next slide in terms of the clever new stuff?
No, I fully agree, and we can go quickly to the next slide. These items are not as prevalent as the systems on the prior 2 slides, but they are worth mentioning. We've seen some of the largest companies using data lakes and data warehouses in order to organize and structure their data that they need because of Pillar 2. We've seen companies leveraging Microsoft Azure along with database technology to pull all the data from its various sources into one centralized place. Some of the tax software vendors are even offering tax-specific off-the-shelf data warehouse tools, such as Thomson Reuters Tax Data Hub. And these solutions are wonderful if you have the means to adopt them. But what about the mid-market companies who are, large enough to be subject to Pillar 2 requirements, but who are not large enough to warrant the purchase of a robust tax data warehouse solution? Many of those companies are saying, look, I need a strategy for automated data wrangling, but I don't have the IT resources to build and maintain a tax data lake or warehouse. And perhaps Pillar 2 is an issue for your company, but you fall into safe harbors for now, and you don't feel the need for a tax data warehouse. And what we're seeing that some of those companies are doing is getting really organized with their file structures and using ETL tools such as Alteryx and things we listed on the prior slide in a thoughtful way to kind of act as a pseudo data warehouse. And then regarding artificial intelligence, I've not seen this deployed widely yet for Pillar 2, but it's a logical next step, especially for those companies who might be using platforms such as Azure or Fabric that have embedded AI functionality. This is an emerging space for now, but I can foresee AI helping companies to identify opportunities to avoid undesirable P2 impacts as time goes on, and once there are larger historical data sets to guide the AI. And I kind of look forward to seeing where this goes.
Yeah, it's an interesting one in terms of the AI. We've had some discussions recently, particularly in the professional services space and the legal firms and things like that, where we're seeing the front end of organizations, businesses utilizing these types of technologies to generate new revenue sources and create levels of disruption. And I think, there's a couple of really interesting books out there in terms of how disruption and disruptive technology can make an impact in this type of market. But we've had a couple of groups that are being asked, well, if we were able to do this on our front end and have a robot lawyer, why aren't we using this technology? And it's almost asking the question at the moment in terms of what is the impact going to be? And some of the vendors that we've touched on today are introducing bits of smarts, bits of large language models to help you find the right answers as part and parcel of their products. But it's certainly an area it's going to create an impact as more data becomes available to be able to run that through. We're just kind of moving that on, Herb, and we've talked a little bit about a couple of the vendors that are out there that are able to deliver on this. We've talked about the strategy for finding ones that are that can do more than one task for you. But how are people going about choosing the right tech at the moment? What does that look like in terms of that market?
Yeah, I mean, I think companies are often, getting demos. They're reaching out to the vendors and taking a look at the solutions and doing, pros and cons of each, comparing, what do I need? What features and functions does this software have? How does it integrate with my existing technology, my existing processes? And they're kind of evaluating pros and cons, and they're looking at the cost.
Yeah. And flipping onto the next 2 slides on, Natalie, if you don't mind. Yeah, I think that's a really good point in terms of how a business is choosing the right solution. It's difficult when there are so many really good solutions out there. Is how do you narrow that down? And I think you're right. It's about being clear in terms of your requirements, having a look at what's out there. We've tried to, BDO, as we've mentioned, is not it's not tied to any particular vendor, and we've tried to run these tech lab sessions recently where we help understand some of the data challenges, and then we'll show a couple of the leading solutions that we think would fit well. And it's just a nice way of being able to kick the tires without necessarily the hard sales pitch that you can get from 1 or 2 of the sales vendors. But is there anything else that groups should be thinking about in this area, Herb, to help them choose the right one?
I mean, I think they need to figure out what they're
Herb's going to go. I think he needs better work.
And what's going to work best for.
You gone? Something ironic about a technology demo and a technology conversation, and Herb can't speak. Are you back, Herb?
Yes, I am back.
Thank you.
Sorry, I guess you didn't hear my previous statement.
No, sorry, we lost you there.
Maybe you can move on.
Okay. So I think in terms of choosing the right solution, there's some great options out there. I think the key point on that is getting yourself a bit of a plan, a bit of a strategy, figuring out your budgets. And just to kind of bring this to life, we've, in a couple of case studies, the first one was a professional services firm. They had some changes in personnel, and that created some challenges for the new teams that came in terms of they didn't necessarily understand fully how it had been done in the past. There were some staff changes, and their starting point was that they were nervous about going into year end with a tax provision process that had been designed on a spreadsheet that they were not comfortable with. And they looked at a few different operating model situations, whether they could do some level of temporary outsourcing. But in the end, they did go down the technology route. They wanted to improve things quickly and wanted to try and join that up holistically. So they had a look at the cost of some of the tech that was out there. They built that business case, but they built it for multiple purposes. It wasn't just the tax provision. They also had the Pillar 2 as part and parcel of it. They were able to deliver pre-Christmas to get some of their disclosure stuff ready, but also to have actually a better year-end process. And that is just coming to an end at the moment, and they've earmarked the start for April. So in terms of a classic approach, change in the organization, lack of understanding of the processes that were there has driven that type of standard or cleaner approach in terms of how they're delivering the Pillar 2. But Herb, do you want to touch on the next slide in terms of a very different approach that one of your US clients took recently?
Sure. Hopefully you can hear me more clearly right now. This slide visually illustrates an ETL-based solution that a client recently put in place to address Pillar 2. The company's headquartered here in the US, and for US parented groups, there are over 40 adjustments to go from US GAAP to Globe. And for this client, they had about 125 new data points that they identified that they needed to consider. And their solution is a combination of using an Excel-based Pillar 2 template combined with an existing tax provision software solution.
We lost you again, Herb. Apologies about the Wi-Fi. Herb, are you back? No.
Alteryx solution processes data from their trial balances and their master data files, which are Excel-based. The solution's able to automate many of their Globe income and tax adjustments, and it automatically produces supporting work papers for manual adjustments. The workflow also creates diagnostics that identify new kinds of master data in the underlying source files, such as new entities and new accounts, which could require technical analysis to determine the proper treatment. Alteryx brings it all together to then feed into their Pillar 2 model and their tax provision software and any other downstream processes. They've also put in place a well-defined file structure for all their source data files, their CSVs and Excel files, and other extracts from source systems, as well as a well-defined file structure for the output files. This provides consistency and stability and really makes the Pillar 2 exercise more mechanical in nature, while also highlighting changes that might require the eyes of a P2 technical specialist. And the solution didn't require the company to purchase any new software, as it leverages their existing software that they were already licensing. The solution took quite an investment of time to build, but it's humming along nicely. It's ready for use for provision right away, and it will help by producing outputs to the compliance process when that time comes. This solution also allows for ease of scenario analysis and forecasting. Another benefit of this methodology is that if and when this company decides to license a Pillar 2 software solution for provision, reporting, or compliance, they already have in place a mechanism to handle the data complexity in a repeatable and scalable way. And we know that data complexity is one of the major, challenges in this entire process. So it can make that, a greatly simplified process by taking this as a first step. And now we'll get into our final polling question.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And before we jump into that, in terms of they're focused on their data, they were able to do some things cost effectively in-house before then moving to. So for groups that aren't quite ready to jump all the way, that's a really good little interim step before going and buying a calculator. But thank you all. We've got one last polling question, and then we'll open it up to questions. It's quite a big topic, and appreciate we've had a really, really quick canter through. There's quite a lot to discuss. There's quite a lot of opportunities. There's quite a lot of areas. We've covered a little bit in terms of the data complexity, a little bit in terms of the system side of things, touched on choosing the right types of technology, and then a couple of case studies to bring it home. But to close us out today, we've got one last poll question, and then we'll open it up for questions. So how do you expect the safe harbors to apply to your business? I think it's been interesting around the safe harbors in terms of groups that are using that as the soft landing and hoping that it's going to cover a lot of their kind of key territory, but what happens after year 3 as well. So it's been a different approach that groups have taken thus far. But Let's give that another couple of seconds. There we go. Yeah, similar to what we saw in the first poll in terms of some still haven't considered it yet, but a good 50% is expected to cover a lot of their territories. And I think that's quite a 48% number is quite a telling stat, Ross. We see that quite heavily in terms of these soft landings are very helpful for that first couple of year period, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think that there's a few things to draw from this. So first, the safe harbors are incredibly useful in terms of simplifying the overall compliance burden, but we are finding with most businesses that we're speaking to that they cannot rely on the safe harbors across every single jurisdiction in which they operate. So it's worth reflecting on that in terms of your Pillar 2 technology solution and what's the right level of effort to apply based on the relative scope of the rules and the number of territories in which you'll need to do full calculations. There's also the point that as it stands today, the safe harbors are only temporary measures. So is there a piece of, well, it's inevitable that more work is going to be required now, and would it make sense to start running a more detailed, sophisticated process through a period where it's a fallback and not something that you're having to rely upon in anger? But I think probably the most significant point at the moment we're seeing at the moment on the transitional safe harbors, where they're relying on the CBCR transitional safe harbors, is that you have to go in some level of detail through your CBCR report preparation process and get comfortable that the CBCR report is capable of being a qualifying CBCR report as defined in the Pillar 2 legislation and associated guidance, because if it's not, you can't rely on the safe harbors and you're into full calculation territory, which makes life a lot more difficult than it might otherwise be. And as we're going through that exercise of reviews, which we've done a number of now, we're finding that there's in every single case, there's been at least one or more adjustments that have been required to the CBCR process in order to enable a business to get comfortable that it would be a qualifying CBCR report and enable access to the safe harbors. So if you are planning to rely on the CBCR safe harbors and you haven't yet done that review of your CBCR report process and gotten comfort that it is a qualifying report for each of the territories in which you operate, then I definitely recommend doing that now.
Thanks, Ross. That's us for today.
Excellent. Well, hopefully that's been a useful overview for you all in terms of working out what role technology might play in your Pillar 2 approach. I think a few takeaways from my side that I'd leave you with. So first, the rules are incredibly complex, and there may be a significant amount of work to do in order to assess the impact of the rules for your organization. Technology will play a key part in simplifying the more repetitive or data-related aspects of the process, so that you can then focus on the challenging technical or judgmental areas, of which there are also many. I think getting a handle on your data is a great starting point. So do revisit or start to create your tax data strategy and assess what is already in your systems and what is not. And think about organizing and structuring that data in a data lake, or building automated data wrangling processes through organized file structures and ETL tools like Alteryx. There are a number of solutions on the market, and they do different things. Finding the right fit for your organization will be key, and we'd be delighted to have conversations with you to help you make that assessment. But in making that assessment, do take a holistic view. Start with what you already have. How does Pillar 2 fit into what you already have, and what will you need to supplement it with? Don't lose sight of the fact that this presents a great opportunity to establish a business case for investment in data, process, technology, and people, not just to address Pillar 2, but to enable a more nimble and effective finance and tax function overall. So do keep that holistic view front of mind, including thinking about training and process requirements across your organization that link in with the topic of Pillar 2. So there are a number of further resources that are available to you, which you'll see in the slides when they get circulated. And we've also listed out here both the webinars that have already happened, where you can see existing slides and recordings, but also the webinar that is still to come in May, where we'll take a deeper dive into compliance and reporting more generally. So we will, as a reminder, be sharing the slides and recording of this particular one after this webinar. If anyone does have any questions that they'd like to raise, final chance to drop them in the Q&A. We've answered a few as we've gone, but do feel free to drop some more in. And even if we can't address it now, we'll try and come back to you after the event for a follow-up conversation.
Confused everybody, Ross.
Well, hopefully we haven't bamboozled you all too much. But what I can say, of having done a number of Pillar 2 calculations for many different organizations, start early and do think about the role that technology can play, because it will become a repetitive process relatively quickly. But if you're spending your time trying to wrangle data, you'll miss some of the key technical and judgmental areas within the rules, which will just create risk and exposure for your organization. Okay, well, with that, we shall close the webinar, but thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir.